He currently works as an independent consultant and board advisor, supporting organizations across real estate. Mr. Rahul Panjabi.
Over time, I've learned that governance only works where leaders practice it daily, not when it's enforced episodically or growth built on shortcuts rarely survives.
So we've narrated that near miss case is the kind of thing only someone who has lived enterprise sales would recognize.
Optimism closes deals, but discipline sustains them. That is very important.
Hello and welcome to FaceTime with Leaders, powered by Directors Institute, World Council of Directors. I'm your host, Sunny Pancholi, and today's episode is about the part of leadership that rarely makes headlines, but quietly decides outcomes. It's about how businesses grow without breaking, how leaders earn trust beyond titles, and how judgments, governance, and accountability show up long before success or failure becomes visible. Today's guest brings over 3 decades of hands-on leadership experience across BPO, ITES, technology, BFSI, real estate, hospitality, and services. He has built markets, owned P&Ls, led go-to-market strategy, closed complex enterprise deals, and advised CXO leadership in highly regulated environments. He currently works as an independent consultant and board advisor, supporting organizations across real estate, IT, and services, and he is actively preparing for independent director responsibilities. What makes his perspective valuable is very simple. He has been on the growth side, the risk side, and the accountability side of the table. So please welcome Mr. Rahul Panjabi.
Thank you, Sunny. That was a beautiful introduction and an in-depth, career path, or not. I should not say career path, but yeah, my past experiences you've given. Thank you so much. Pleasure being here with you.
So, Mr. Rahul, looking forward to a great conversation ahead.
Please, sure. Likewise.
So, you have had a long and diverse career across BPO, technology, BFSI, real estate, hospitality, and services. And you have worked at different stages of the business, from building markets to advising leadership. Now, let's start at the beginning. Take us through your career journey so far, how it started, how it evolved across industries, and what shaped the way you work and lead today.
Thanks, Sunny, for asking that question. Yeah, it's been a very interesting journey for me. And what has happened is, I started my career as, if you would not believe it, as an accountant in one of the firms. And I realized, that because I had done my BCom with accountancy and auditing, I started as an accountant. And through that initial journey, I realized that accountancy and table work was not for me, desk work. I quickly tried my way into little operations, then into sales and business development and customer service. That's where I realized what my forte was. But unfortunately for me, that company, did not allow me to move the department. So I took another hop and went into business development, sales, customer service. And there's been no stopping, It's like I've learned throughout these 30 years, the highs, the lows, the pits, dealing with different kind of people and their lifestyles. How do I handle people? What I have, I won't say I've committed mistakes. I would call them learnings, right? I mean, trying to sound positive. I have learned a lot through this journey. Try to keep things as normal as possible, but that never happens. So yeah, it's been an interesting journey for me. I won't say smooth, highs and lows. So yeah, that's been my journey so far. And I'm looking at currently, to expand myself, in a different strategic role. And so I've taken my path, changed it at this point of time where I can be doing much better than what I was doing after having learned so much.
Mr. Rahul, that was such an honest look into your journey. And it's fascinating how your path moved across industries, but still carries one clear thread. You have stitched experiences from different worlds into one story.
Right.
All right. So, continuing our conversation, you have spent years in roles where growth, revenue, and targets were non negotiable. And at the same time, you were responsible for controls, contracts, and long term impact. So, from your experience, Rahul, What's the hardest part of driving growth without letting governance slip, especially when teams are under pressure to deliver quickly?
That's a good question, Sunny. One of the hardest realities I've lived throughout my career is that growth and governance don't naturally move at the same speed. Growth wants momentum, monthly closures, aggressive targets, rapid scaling. Government wants pause, checks, controls, contracts, and consequences. The real tension shows up when teams are under pressure and the organization is judged quarter by quarter. I felt this mostly, sharply in roles where revenue targets were non-negotiable. That happens all the time. But the cost of getting it wrong could be, long lasting. I remember a situation during a high pressure sales cycle where a large cycle could have closed quickly. If we had relaxed certain contractual and control checks, the team was frustrated, the quarter was tight, everyone wanted velocity, but something didn't, sit right. The risk allocation and compliance language, they weren't robust enough. It felt like that at moment, like in a film where everything is going right, the win is right, but it comes under a hidden cost. I chose to slow the deal down. The decision wasn't popular, as you can understand. It's normal. I took heat for it, and we did feel the pressure of potentially missing numbers. But what mattered to me was the culture signal we were sending, where the speed mattered more than responsibility. And what helped me navigate these moments was my exposure across industries. BPO taught me operational discipline and the importance of SLAs. BFSI sharpened my instinct for controls and regulatory consequences. In fact, technology showed me how fast organizations can move and how quickly things can break. Real estate especially taught me the weight of long-term commitments, where shortcuts today become liabilities tomorrow. And each sector has its own temptation zone, but the principle remains the same. The payoff from the hardest decision came later. The deal eventually closed, stronger, cleaner, and with fewer downstream issues. Most importantly, teams understood that governance wasn't a blocker, it was a guardrail. And Sunny, over time, I've learned that governance only works where leaders practice it daily, not when it's enforced episodically or, growth built on shortcuts rarely survives. As a leader and now as someone preparing for board responsibilities, I believe that the real role is to help organizations they win the long game, even when the short game feels uncomfortable. The balance between ambition and discipline is where sustainable growth actually, lives.
Absolutely, Mr. Rahul. And that was such a grounded take. You did not sugarcoat the pressure leaders face, and that honesty makes the insight land. And you explained
Thank
that
you, Sunny.
balancing act really beautifully. It's clear you have lived this tension, not just read about it.
Thank you, Sunny.
All right. So, moving ahead, you have led and closed large enterprise deals across India and international markets, often involving long sales cycles, multiple stakeholders, and tight compliance requirements. Now, when you look at enterprise deals that succeed versus those that create problems later, what do you see leaders getting right, and what do you see them getting wrong at the decision stage?
That is a valid and somewhat tricky question, Sunny. Not wanting to quote anyone from the past. Enterprise deals, they often look impressive from the outside, long negotiations, large ticket sizes, global stakeholders, and compliance layers. But in my experience across India and international markets, the real story of whether a deal will thrive or haunt you, usually, it reveals itself at the decision stage, not at the signing ceremony. That's where the seeds of success or future pain, they are quietly planted. I recall an international engagement earlier in my career where the numbers looked perfect on paper. Strong volume projections, market branding, senior sponsorships on both sides. Pressure to close was very intense. But as we move deeper, I sense disconnects, between what sales was hearing, what operations could realistically deliver, and how compliance interpreted certain clauses. Everyone had a different version of understood risk. That moment, it reminded me of a principle I've carried since. Optimism closes deals, but discipline sustains them. That is very important. What I've constantly seen across industries, BPO, BFSI, technology, real estate services, it's a clear pattern. Deals that succeed are led by leaders who slow down at the right moment. They spend understanding, the client's true intent, not just start, stated volumes. They bring finance, operations, legal, compliance into the conversation early, even when it feels inconvenient. At times people say, "Oh, why now?" But it's best if it's done. Then they ask uncomfortable questions before the enthusiasm takes over, which is perfectly normal and it should be done. Where deals go wrong is equally predictable. Leaders chase size over sustainability and suitability. Due diligence becomes a checklist exercise. Risk gets pushed downstream with the hope that we'll manage it later. I've seen a BFSI style risk lens save a technology engagement. And I've seen a BPO mindset of over-promising, create long-term stress in real estate link services contracts. Different industries, same mistakes. There was a point where I chose to reopen a clause and slow a deal that everyone wanted to rush. It wasn't popular. I've never been a popular person wherever I've been because of all these things that I do. But in the end, people realized that it was, a good thing that happened. And that particular incident, it meant revisiting assumptions and risking timelines. But that discomfort protected the organization later from delivery disputes, margin erosion, reputational strain. In hindsight, the leadership recognized that pause as maturity, not resistance. Also, what years of enterprise deal making have taught me is this: good decisions aren't aggressive, they're aligned. The real secret isn't speed, it's clarity, shared accountability, and the courage to ask the hard questions early. That's the difference between the deals that scale and the deals that quietly unravel.
Mr. Rahul, that was such a sharp breakdown. You really showed how the real story of a deal begins after the signatures. And the way you narrated that near miss case is the kind of thing only someone who has lived enterprise sales would recognize. So great. Thank you for sharing that insight and perspective with us.
You're welcome, sir.
So, a lot of your work has been in regulated or compliance driven environments, BFSI, audit led solutions, collections, and services where the margin for error is really, really small or tight. Now, based on that experience, what are the key risk leaders tend to underestimate in regulated businesses, and what disciplines make the biggest difference in staying out of trouble?
Yes, that's right, Sunny. Operating in regulated businesses feels very different from operating in conventional growth environments. In BFSI audit-led solutions, collections, compliance-heavy services, you're constantly aware that every decision, leaves a trail. Emails, approvals, documentation, audit logs. The margin of error is very thin, and the consequences of a small miss often surface later when the pressure is highest and the room is full of auditors or regulators. Leaders who haven't lived inside the world often underestimate that invisible weight. I remember a situation where a seemingly minor documentation gap, something that looked administrative at first glance, nearly escalated into a serious compliance issue. Timelines were tight, teams were stretched, and there was pressure to manage it later. I'll admit my initial instinct was that it is a solvable operational problem. But as we dug deeper, it became clear that a misread clause combined with incomplete documentation, it could have triggered a broader audit concern. What saved us wasn't heroics. It was a discipline we had enforced earlier. Layered reviews and the habit of asking one extra question even when things looked fine. Across regulated industries, the risk leaders tend to underestimate are rarely dramatic. They are disguised as small oversights, overconfidence in manual workarounds, poor alignment between operations and compliance, or assuming that an international client standards automatically fit, local regulatory expectations. I've seen how casual slip in collections can snowball into a legal issue. How minor lapse in BFSI documentation can compliance audits complicate the audits, and how a missed clause in a service contract can quietly erode margins over time. Also, what consistently makes the biggest difference is discipline at the front end. Slowing decisions when something feels off, encouraging teams to challenge assumptions without fear, tightening documentation, even under delivery pressure, and ensuring finance, operations, risk and legal teams are aligned early, not brought in after the fact. I've pushed back on speed more than once to protect long term stability. And while it's uncomfortable in the moment, it pays off later. Also, in regulated businesses, organizations aren't punished for being cautious, they are punished for being careless. The leaders who stay out of trouble build systems that don't rely on fast minute fixes and individual brilliance. These disciplines have shaped they've shaped my own approach, patient, detailed awareness, and calm under scrutiny. Over time, that mindset doesn't slow growth, it protects its running.
Rightly said, Mr. Rahul, and that was such an eye-opening take. You explained the
Thank you.
pressure inside regulated setups so clearly, and it's rare to hear leaders talk about the small misses that turns into big risk. So
Thank
your
you, sir.
example really brings it home.
Appreciate it.
All right, so let's move ahead, and this is my favorite part of this podcast, that is rapid fire round. Quick questions, quick instinctive answers, no overthinking. So are
Okay.
you up for it?
Yes, go ahead.
All right. So here's my first question to you. The first thing you do when you wake up.
I pause before the noise starts.
Okay, nice. Your go-to comfort food after a long work day?
Home food, familiar and grounding.
Great. One thing that instantly relaxes you.
Walking, no phones, no agenda.
Nice. A book that genuinely changed the way you think.
Meditations, it taught me how to stay steady when things get noisy.
Wow. A movie you can watch again and again without getting bored.
The Shawshank Redemption, patience, perspective, and quiet resilience.
Mine favorite too. What a film it is. All right, moving on to the next question. One place you haven't been to yet, but really want to.
Portugal, unhurried, layered, and reflective.
Wow. A skill you are still trying to get better at.
Letting go, especially when effort doesn't equal outcome.
Nice. Your favorite way to switch off on weekends?
Unstructured time, no calendar, no targets.
Great. Last question of the rapid fire round. Success in one word to you.
Clarity.
Wow. So that is why I love this, rapid fire round. It's quick, it's fun, it's warm, and this way you come to know the personal side of the professional.
Yeah, the first thoughts.
Yes, absolutely. Great. All right, moving on to the next segment. Mr. Rahul, I want to anchor this conversation around a real, widely discussed case that many boards still study today, the Wells Fargo fake accounts scandal. This was an organization with strong brand values, layers of compliance, and experienced leadership, yet unethical practices continued for years before they surfaced publicly, right?
Right.
So, when you look at that case from a governance and leadership lens, what does it really tell us about how large organizations fail, not suddenly, but quietly?
Wells Fargo. Yeah, that was some case. The reason the Wells Fargo fake account scandal still haunts boardrooms is because it wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was a quiet, prolonged failure. Now, I'll tell you how. This was a highly respected institution with a strong brand, deep compliance structures, experienced leadership. And yet, unethical behavior continued for years without triggering, decisive intervention. For anyone who has worked in BFSI or compliance-heavy environments, that pattern feels uncomfortably familiar. What causes this, reveal is that large organizations fail, rarely they fail overnight. They fall incrementally. It usually starts with small deviations, targets that feel, slightly unrealistic, incentives that reward outcomes without questioning methods, and early warning signs that get rationalized away as exceptions. Over time, those exceptions become norm. Pressure rises, silence grows, ethical erosion becomes part of the operating rhythm rather than a red flag. I've seen echoes of this in my own career. In regulated environments, there were moments when teams normalized minor shortcuts. That normally happens, because delivery pressure was intense and leadership signals were ambiguous. In one instance, a small process gap, initially dismissed as an operational noise, had the potential to grow into a serious compliance issue. What struck me was how quickly people stopped questioning it, not because they were unethical, because they were conditioned to prioritize targets over discomfort. That's what the Wells Fargo case, really exposes. It wasn't a lack of policies, Sunny. It was a failure of culture and listening, fear of speaking up, distorted incentives, and leaders unintentionally, rewarding the wrong behaviors. I've seen this pattern across industries, BFSI, audit driven functions, and services, where the governance becomes mechanical and conversations lose honesty. Compliance exists on paper, but curiosity disappears. There was a moment in my own journey when I realized the true cost of silence. Catching a small deviation early meant slowing things down and not facing resistance. It wasn't popular, but it prevented a larger issue later. The experience taught me that ethics isn't about dramatic whistleblowing moments. It's about early uncomfortable interventions. The enduring lesson from Wells Fargo is simple but demanding. Organizations don't collapse because of one bad act. They collapse when the leaders stop paying attention. And governance is not about layers of or controls. It's about culture, clarity, and courage. Boards and leaders must stay alert to the quiet signals because by the time failure becomes visible, it has usually been years in the making, Sunny.
Absolutely, Mr. Rahul, and that was such a sharp and honest take. You explained how organizations don't collapse overnight, but drip through quite cracks. And the way you connected that case to real patterns inside regulated businesses, that's the kind of depth listeners don't usually get.
Right.
Incredible. So, Mr. Rahul, that brings us to the last segment, last question of the podcast. And since you have recently joined Directors Institute as part of your journey towards independent director and board advisory roles, how has that experience influenced the way you now think about board responsibilities?
That's a good question, Sunny. Joining the Directors Institute marked a very clear shift in how I think about responsibility. In executive roles, you are trained to be inside the engine, solving problems quickly, driving numbers, closing gaps, and keeping operations moving. Board thinking operates at a very different altitude. You're no longer adjusting, dials in real time. You're stepping back, looking at the entire system and asking whether it's fundamentally healthy, ethical, and sustainable. One moment during the program that really stayed with me was a governance simulation where board members had to take decisions with incomplete information. There was discomfort in that exercise because, you realize how easy it is for early warning signals to look like noise and how much weight sits behind every board discussion and resolution. It reminded me that boards don't have the luxury of operational closeness. They have to rely on judgment platforms and the quality of questions they ask. Also, the program sharpened my understanding of the quiet weight of board responsibility. It's about stewardship, protecting shareholder interest, ensuring ethical conduct, and guiding the management. That is very important without crossing into execution. And having worked through BFSI, real estate, technology, and services, I've seen how governance challenges change by sector, but the principle remains constant. Boards don't manage daily chaos, they watch for slow moving risks, a cultural drift, incentive misalignment, or pressure points that don't show up on dashboards until it's too late. It also made me reflect on moments earlier in my career where I saw issues purely as operational, a policy gap, a team under sustained pressure, or a process shortcut. Things I once viewed as fixable execution problems. Through a board lens today, I recognize those as signals of deeper systematic or cultural strain. They shift in interpretation has been one of the most valuable personal learnings for me. Um, Also, what the Directors Institute reinforces is that board roles aren't about authority or prestige. They're about foresight, restraint, and the courage to ask uncomfortable questions early. Good boards don't wait for crisis to act, Sunny. They build culture, systems, and clarity that prevent those crises from forming. That perspective has fundamentally reshaped on how now I view responsibility at the highest level. Yeah,
I'm so glad to hear that, Mr. Rahul. And that was such a grounded explanation of how the board lens is so different from the executive lens. And,
right.
you made that shift feel incredibly real, like stepping into a different altitude of responsibility.
Thank you, sir.
So let me tell you, Mr. Rahul, this conversation today was a reminder that leadership is not defined by titles or targets alone. It
Right.
is defined by judgment under pressure, by the discipline to balance growth with governance,
True.
and by the courage to speak up when something feels wrong, even when numbers look right. Absolutely. Mr. Rahul's journey shows what happens when experience across industries meets clarity at the boardroom level, where decisions are not about the next quarter, but about long term value, trust, and responsibility. So, for everyone listening, the takeaway is very simple. Strong businesses are not built only by ambition, they are sustained by ethics, oversight, and leaders who understand the weight of their decisions. And Mr. Rahul, thank you so much for sharing your experience and perspective with such openness and maturity. Really, truly, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sunny. It was a pleasure talking to you.
And to our audience, thank you for joining us on FaceTime with Leaders, powered by Directors Institute, World Council of Directors. I'm your host, Sunny Pancholi, signing off for now. I will see you in the next episode. Thank you so much.